Sarah Atherton, do you want to take us forward on this one?
Thank you, Chair. Good afternoon, all. The Civil Contingencies Act places no statutory responsibility on the MOD to plan and prepare for civil emergencies, but the military have been utilised in crises like the foot and mouth. So what lessons did we draw from previous military involvement in civil crises into today's pandemic?
David, do you want to start off again?
I believe there is, if you look at the very broad picture, perhaps I'm being a little too academic, but I believe there is a process of civilianization of emergency management that has gone on at different paces in different countries, but it is a process that needs to go on and that is necessary to manage the modern emergency. I also think it's somewhat necessary to get out of a military way of thinking in managing emergencies, and that the countries that cope best are those that do so, providing that they then put in place an adequate structure for managing things in a civilian manner. Now, what I want to avoid at all costs is that I come over as anti-military. I spent a year of my life teaching at a military university, and it was one of the best experiences of my career. I've got tremendous affection and respect for the military. I often find, though, that military commanders, when I talk to them about these issues, say that they would really rather deal with defense matters because that's what they're really there for. And with the slimming down of modern militaries, they find themselves easily overstretched when they have to do big things on a civilian front. Whereas 50, 60, 70 or 100 years ago, the only forces in the field in many places would be military ones. What we really need to do is to build up the civilian forces, the civilian mechanisms, planning and management structures at all levels from local to national, and in so doing to involve the population in that. And I think one of the great lessons that must be learned from this pandemic is the need to involve people better. The countries that have coped best seem to be those where there has been the best form of disciplined involvement of the population in a civilian exercise to get this whole thing under control. So I wouldn't wish to minimize the military's capabilities. Absolutely marvelous what they can do in terms of, for example, setting up field hospitals, transportation and so on, and very necessary. The Oslo agreements on these things say that in humanitarian actions, military forces should be under civilian control. And that is an agreement signed by many countries and also upgraded afterwards, renewed. I think, though, that civil protection in this country needs a fillip. It needs to be pushed forward and improved. I can recall that in London, a year or two before this, there was a big initiative that was then somewhat stifled by the Brexit problem that put everything on a back burner, to get together civil organisations, faith-based organisations, volunteer organisations. Britain is not a country where civil protection volunteerism is well developed. I'm speaking to you from Italy. I'm a dual national Italian British citizenship, and in Italy there are 3,600 volunteer organisations, 36 federated nationally. In the last 4 major emergencies, disasters, they put more volunteers into the field than local population. And this is a tradition that goes back 776 years. What it does is connect the people with the system very well. I think in Britain we need better ways of connecting the people with the system, especially when you're requiring people to do things, and where one of the ways to tackle the pandemic is to get the prevention, the control, the testing, the tracing, and so on into the community. And I think really the further civilianization of emergency management will help this. It will also help with the process of making this more inclusive, ethnically, gender-wise, age-wise, and in other respects.
Thank you, David. Can I ask the same question, please, to Jennifer and Bruce?
Yeah, if I'll go first. I refer you back and kind of refer anybody in this back to some work we did at RUSI, I think going back to about 2010, which was called Defence Without an Enemy. And it was actually looking at what we needed to think about in terms of our armed forces going into a century where the major threats would likely to not come from state actors invading your borders, but were more likely to come from severe weather, from emerging diseases, and what that actually meant in terms of defending your country against those threats and perhaps getting out of a military mindset and kind of looking for enemies to really kind of a whole of society response to that. And what we'd lost from some of the civil defence from the Cold War planning that again kind of disappeared and not really gone anywhere else. And I think definitely in there is a way that we think about things. You know, what are we actually looking to do? Are we looking outwards to where the threat has come from? And we've seen the dangers of that in the US response to this, rather than looking at how do we band together and strengthen society internally against the issues that it's causing. And I think absolutely within that, as David mentioned, is the need for a volunteer organisation and volunteer force that is ready at a society level to step into that. And Bruce, you may remember that I think you commissioned RUSI to do the work on community resilience back in about 2000 to 2008, when we actually did a comparison of some international models. And one of the things we found is that the countries that responded best to strategic shocks, whether those were large terrorist attacks, whether they were flooding events, were the ones that regularly had to deal with small events. So the two exemplar case studies were the Chinese earthquake response, which went down to literally an earthquake warden on every street, who people knew to look to as the person who kind of knew what to do if the ground started to shake. And then in the US, it was in the hurricane. And again, down at a very, very local level, went into the rural communities. And that this trained people, it prepared them, it meant they knew what they needed to keep in their homes, to survive in their homes for 2 weeks, which is one of the things we realised here wasn't in place with as they panic buying very loosely. I think people were told to go and stock up for 2 weeks, and they did, and then everybody seemed to be surprised that had emptied supermarkets. But that brings with it a lot of additional skills that are needed. So for instance, in the hurricane states in the US, one of the things they did is they trained people to be insurance company enumerators who could actually go around and assess damage and report it back to the insurance companies so that insurance claims got settled more quickly. It meant that they knew where the vulnerable people were. They knew where the very elderly who lived alone were. They knew where people who might have mobility difficulties, who couldn't get to shelter very easily, lived. They knew where homeless people were. And I think that very localized ability to understand and know your community and to be able to operate in your community and talk to the people in it is something very important. And we don't have that in the UK. We have some organisations, the volunteer organisations are largely either populated by retired people, and they do a very good job, but I think there is also need for people in their 20s and 30s to be part of that. And or they are populated by people who add expertise at the weekend to what is their day job during the week. And that therefore, when something like this happens, they are likely to be completely overworked and overburdened during their day job. And just at the time their surge capacity is needed, it's potentially less available. And I think those are two things that we need to look at very carefully. One of the challenges with that has always been, if you have that body of people in place, how do you keep them interested and keep them busy and keep them on board in the times when not a lot is happening? And I think the models I would look to that is, particularly in Israel, their ambulance service is largely staffed by volunteers. It's a ratio of about 10-1, professional ambulance staff to volunteer first aiders. And the volunteer first aiders do 3 or 4 hours a week each. But then if you need 10 times as many of them, they can all do their 4 hours at the same time. And so I think that looking at that, how do you scale up in those kind of responses is very valuable. I've got a slide that I sometimes give in emergency planning lectures of a military first aiders helping out. And the reason I use it is because the person who's most prominent in that slide is he's a military reserve. He's a St John's ambulance trainer, and he's an ambulance paramedic in his day job. On paper, he can sometimes look as that's three separate people that you have, three separate lots of resources that you have. In fact, you don't, you have one. And I think conversely, in a way, as we civilianize some of the emergency planning, we rely more and more on that civilian expertise. And so we actually lose our redundancy. And so I think that's actually a very, very delicate balance to consider. Now, as we scale down the military and we rely more on the reserves, those reserves have other jobs as well. And quite often the expertise they are lending to the military is expertise that may be needed in twice its capacity during these times of crisis. And so I think how you recruit, how you finance, how you train, and how you keep active and keep up to date such a force is a clear issue. But I think actually the kind of things we are likely to face in the 21st century are likely to mean that they are needed more and more often, and therefore keeping them engaged in between one crisis and the next may not be the problem it has been at times in the past.
Thank you. Bruce, would you like to comment?
David, I saw your hand go up. Did you want to come back on what Jennifer's just said?
Only very briefly. In the town, thank you. In the town that I'm in here, the volunteer ambulance service was founded in 1535. It's absolutely rock solid. The point about it is that also it's very modern. The point about it is that there is a culture of civil protection that connects the people with the system to the point that the system is the people. And I think that's very effective.
So Bruce, would you concur?
Yeah, sure. Of course. I think there are two parts to the answer to this question, which are under the umbrella of the whole of society, the phrase we keep coming back to, especially for the major emergencies. It's a whole of society effort. Starting with the military, we may or may not come back to the point you raised right at the beginning about responsibilities in law, which are on some bodies but not on others. I'd be happy to come back to that. On the role of the military and the lessons learned, I think what we tend to see in this country is a bit Groundhog Day, a bit rinse and repeat. We keep seeing the same things. So classically, foot and mouth was an example. I'll give a couple of others. There were perhaps weaknesses in risk assessment, but there were certainly weaknesses in preparedness in the Ministry of Agriculture of the day. There was insufficient capacity and capability, which meant the military had to be called in, as it were, to bail out civilian government organizations. Similarly, if I just take a couple of examples from my experience in the summer floods of 2007, you may remember that water supply was lost to 10 parts of southwest England, which was a weakness in risk assessment. It was a weakness in preparedness. The particular water pumping station was not prepared, despite being next to a major river or major flooding, which meant that the military had to be brought in to help the civil authorities deal with an emergency. Similarly, overnight, we asked the military to build a defensive barrier around a switching station near Gloucester, which, had it been lost, would have meant that power was lost to many hundreds of thousands of people in South Wales and the Southwest for a very long time, many weeks. Again, that was a very short notice request based on failure of risk assessment. The switching station was built on a floodplain and it did not have adequate defences. So, as I say, what we tend to see at the moment is a repetitive cycle of weaknesses in risk assessment, weaknesses in preparedness, meaning short notice calls to the military, especially, to come in and bail out civil authorities. So we made it one of our objectives, very fundamentally, and here I absolutely agree with David, which is it is not a respectable position for the public authorities not to be sufficiently prepared. You can call that civilianisation of emergency planning if you want. I would say, actually, if civil authorities have got a responsibility in the emergency preparedness field, they must fulfil it. And calling in the military in that way is a sign of failure. That is in a way which is not pre-planned. It's a deeper sign of failure which worries me, which is if there are those weaknesses which we described, there are also weaknesses in taking prevention action to try to prevent the risk arising in the first place. So that switching station was built in a floodplain, did not have adequate defences. The water pumping station, which I described, had all of its electricity circuits and everything else, all of its major control systems, where they could be flooded if the river it was sitting alongside flooded. I just give those as examples. So actually, in risk management terms, it's not even a weakness in the response phase, the weakness in prevention, which stops the risk arising in the first place. So you don't need the need for the heroics. Where we've drawn on the military in time, and I can reel off a dozen examples, tends to be in three areas. And that is, first of all, organizational capacity and capability, at which the military are brilliant. Organized, disciplined, innovative people. If there is a problem to be fixed, they're absolutely brilliant at fixing that problem. That's the first point. The second is they've got assets, fewer than most people think. They've got assets, they've got airfields, they've got bases, they've got trucks, they've got skills, and of course, we've drawn on Alder Marston after the Litvinenko poisoning and Porton Down after the Skripal's incident and so on. So there's a wide range of capabilities which can be drawn on. And third then, they're a ready source of, in an emergency, just ordinary people capacity. 1,000 people to build a defensive wall around a switching station. I don't know how many thousand people to distribute water from Chatham Racecourse around the southwest of England. So those are the areas in which we've tended to use them. We might pick up on those in later debate. And I think in all those three areas, they absolutely excel. I'm going to pick up on the point of community resilience, because I do fundamentally believe it. I took over in the Civil Contingency Secretariat in 2004. Government bodies were not good enough at that time at fulfilling their emergency management responsibilities. And the Civil Contingencies Act and the programs we put in place aim to improve that. But we realized in about 2007, especially with the major flooding and foot and mouth and so on that we saw then, the need for whole of society effort, and in particular, not just the voluntary sector, but communities, individual households and families, not only could play their part, but actually government had a responsibility to help them play their part, and a responsibility to business to help business prepare. So we launched two things. First, the National Risk Register, the first, to try to give the public some view of what we were seeing in a secret document, some views which could help them prepare, and businesses, of course. And secondly, as Jennifer has said, the Community Resilience, the name we use in the UK, the Community Resilience Initiative, to try to help and give some government support to communities who wanted to prepare for themselves, usually passed through local authorities. I absolutely agree with David Alexander and Jennifer that in a whole of society approach, getting the community engaged is fundamental and has to go beyond the voluntary sector. The Community Resilience Initiative is now actually an international initiative. There's a group of countries joined together to take that work forward, of which actually Italy is one of the leading members, all of which is great. Has it gone far enough inside the UK? Absolutely not. Should it be? Yes. Thank you.
Okay.